Good evening, students. Continuation to the previous lecture on conceptualization, observation, and experiment. I'm going to continue with the same method of data collection on experiment. I've largely introduced the method of experiment in the previous class. In this present class, I would like to introduce the various designs in experiment. Okay. The first of all, actually, I would like to retouch upon the idea of what is that experiment and what is the importance of experiment is all about. Okay. Importance of the experiment is, number first is that it is to test the causal idea, to test the causal hypothesis and to establish the causal relations. What did it exactly mean by to test the causal hypothesis or hypothesis and the relationship is that to understand the influence of one variable over the other. That means this is the change variable which we introduce into the course of study. The second is that to understand the outcome or the effect of the other variable. Along with this, when these two objects or when these two variables, two or multiple variables, when it interacts, what kind of phenomena, the third, what kind of phenomenon or phenomena occurs. So this is what largely the very idea of the experiment. When you do this, what you are trying to do here is that at the end of the experiment, we are trying to narrate the nature and the relationship among different variables, multiple variables in production of certain phenomena. This is what exactly the very idea of the experiment is all about. However, I am going to make you to understand the experiment from two different points, or you can say that I am going to explain the very idea of experiment from the point of view of science as well as from the point of view of social sciences. Okay. So the first is that the very idea of experiment in science, either it is engineering or even for instance in natural sciences in general, is that the very idea of the science to understand the mission, materials, chemicals and the life. Here the life, which means different species, we are trying to understand from microorganism to humans. Microorganism to human. So this is what basically the scientists or the researchers within science, they try to understand or they attempt to understand. So the researchers' focus is on this. Okay. On the other hand, the researchers' focus within social sciences, largely focused on individuals. That means humans are the focus of the study. They may be like we are trying to understand the behaviors, we are trying to understand the behaviors, emotions, feelings, sentiment, and values, norms, all these things we are trying to understand through human. Okay, so here the researcher, one should not forget that here the researcher is also an individual in the society. So that means here the object of the study which means here we are mainly focused on understanding the human relations. At the same time, when the researcher engaged in understanding the human relations, he or she also becomes the object of the study. Here, the researcher himself becomes the object of the study. At the same time, vice versa, when you come to the science, okay, the relations between the researcher and the object of the study is something which is detached in nature. But when you come to the social sciences, the relations between the object of the study as well as the researcher is something which is highly attached through human relations. So when you do experiment, when a researcher, he or she, okay, rather experiment within social sciences, within the larger area of the social sciences, from economics to sociology to psychology, it's not only that he is observing the research subjects, but also he is trying to observe himself or herself in the process of experiment. Okay, so that means the duality, that means the dual process of investigation goes. One is the investigation which happens outside of the individual. At the same time, the investigation goes within the individual itself. So always keep this in mind that the social sciences is something, it carries a kind of a dualism. It carries the dual investigation process. But at the same time, when you come to the kind of the science, the researchers actually, if you try to look at it, always that the object of the study is something which is a kind of a material in nature. Okay, when it is highly material in nature, we don't associate largely with the with the object of the study. Okay, we try to maintain that the distance. That's why that the science is more, we claim that the science is more objective in nature. On the other hand, when you come to the social sciences, there is a general critique of this. The social sciences is that it's highly subjective nature, because we will be like, the researchers within social sciences may be biased in doing a kind of an experiment. Okay, the biasness is something introduced, something by default, it persists within the research environment, and it also persists within the object of the study itself. So please keep this clarity in mind. Okay, from here we are going to understand what are the very kind of important components of experiment. Important components of experiment. The first component is that each and every experiment carries pre-test as well as post-test factors. Okay, what is this pre-test? Okay, the pre-test, which means it measures the independent variables and also the group with which we introduce those variables. That means we would like to clearly, I would like to come to a kind of an example. I would like to give an example of this. So the first is that we measure the independent variables and also the group with which we introduce those variables. So when we do the pre-test, that means we are going to measure two different things. One is that independent variable we will be measuring, we will be understanding. At the same time, we will also understand the group. Okay, and after this, the post-test, once the experiment is over, we would like to measure the outcome of dependent variable. That means the dependent variable is here, it's the group. So we would like to check that how far the variables which we introduced during the course of experiment, how far it has influenced the group. So we will be able to re-examine once again that whether it has changed or whether it has any sort of an impact within the group or not. Okay, so for example, if I would like to go and give a kind of an example here, I would like to understand the performance of the students. Performance of the students in certain subject. What I do here is that I take two different groups. I'm going to take the group 1 and the group 2. Okay, so in the group 1, what I do is that I'm going to tell them that I'm going to give a kind of an different set of training, formal training, and once the formal training is introduced into the group, and after the training I would like to evaluate. Okay. On the other hand, the group 2 is that I'll be able to tell the group 2 is that I'm not going to give kind of any formal training, no formal training, but I will be asking them to do a kind of a self-study. And then finally, I would like to evaluate eventually. So the evaluation patterns, for instance, for both the groups are same. For evaluation pattern for both the groups are one and the same. At the same time, I would like to understand before the beginning of the experiment, I would like to understand both the groups understanding or the standards, understanding of the concepts or their standard of knowledge. Then once I will be we will be able to set that experiment process, and we give a kind of a certain time duration. We introduce the time durations, how long we are going to give. For instance, it may be a kind of 1 month, 1 month or 2 months period of a time, or even for in certain cases 3 months. And after the 3 months period of a time, okay, so we'll be suggesting what is supposed to what they are supposed to study, and what kind of an the training which they needed, and what kind of methods they are supposed to follow. So each and everything I'll be able to give it to both the groups, but only I'll be like varying here is that in one group I am introducing the training, in another group I'm not going to introduce any training, but at the end of the day we are going to evaluate both the groups equally. So and after 3 months, for instance, after 2 months or 3 months, we are going to evaluate once again. When the evaluation happens, so we will be able to understand that really the training influenced the outcome or not. Really, the training influenced the knowledge outcome or not. Whether the self study really influenced the knowledge outcome or not. So the evaluations I'll be able to tell, and I'll be able to like come to a kind of a conclusion is that in certain 2 conclusions we will be like able to arrive. For instance, one of the conclusion is that maybe a kind of an out of 5 students, 3 students are able to follow the training properly, so their knowledge outcome is very good. Knowledge outcome is very good, and 2 of them didn't follow the training properly, so their knowledge outcome is little poor in nature. At the same time, I'll be like able to tell that for instance, in the case of a self-study, those who all are highly like having a kind of an aspirations, they are able to do a kind of an self-study, maybe a kind of an 1% out of the 5. The rest of the 4 are in the kind of an poor category, or maybe in the medium category or middle category. Okay, this is what a kind of an the pre-test and the post-test, which means we are going to evaluate, understand, we are going to measure the group as well as the independent variable. So here the independent variable is the training, what kind of a training which we are going to give. So clearly explaining the methods or the procedures of the training will be carried forward. At the same time, we will also measure that standard or the understanding of the concept of these 2 different groups. So the pre-test is about measuring the independent variable as well as understanding the group, okay, the group dynamics with which we are going to introduce those variables. And the post-test is about measuring the outcome of independent variable within the group. So through which you will be able to say that what kind of a phenomena occurs. So this is what actually like we will be able to capture through testing. Before doing an experiment, we do pre-test and as well as the post-test. Okay, so the pre-test and the post-test are the very important component of experiment. The second one is that how we are going to evaluate this. How we are going to do this kind of an evaluations. We will be able to do a kind of an evaluations through introducing variables. So the measuring happens through variables. So here what happens here is that we are going to introduce variables. I have already explained in the previous unit. I have explained what is variable. I am going to elaborate on this variable, and these variables are not something which is related to science, okay, or engineering. These variables are something which is related to the social sciences in general. Okay, so what is variable is about? The variable is about a type or a construct of an object. It explains about the characteristics or the attributes. Okay, this is what the explanations for the variable. There are 3 different set of variables. different set of variables. One is independent variable. The second one is dependent variable. The third one is moderating or intermediate variable. Intermediate variable. The independent variable, as I have already explained, that independent variable is explains about the cause or the reason for producing a change in the another variable. The dependent variable is that it is an outcome, or it explains the effect of the cause. Okay. On the other hand, the moderating or intermediate variable is that it attempts to influence both independent as well as dependent variable during the course of experiment. Okay. For instance, you will be able to introduce a certain new set of experiments. That new set of experiments may result in new dimensions of the study, or it may produce new set of phenomena. Okay, so that this is a kind of a catalyst in science. Okay, so you always keep that the variables in terms of an independent, dependent, and moderating variables, and we are going to categorize these variables in terms of number one, whether the variable is for instance it is dichotomous in nature. What is this dichotomous in nature? Which has two values. Okay, for instance, the two values in terms of whether male or female. Okay, so it has only the two values it has its. The second one is that it is the continuous variable. The continuous variable explains the values, or the values falls under fall under the given range. Okay. For instance, the explanation of the income categories. Okay, or the age. Okay, income, age, these all are something which is very continuous in nature. For instance, in science, it would be called as, for instance, temperature, speed. These are very continuous in nature, and fractional as well as infinite. Fractional and infinite in nature. There is a third set of a variable. The third set of a variable is discrete. The discrete variable falls into certain categories. For example is that, take an example of a religion. Okay. Take an example of a religion. The religion in terms of, for example, whether the given population are Hindus, Muslims, or for instance Christians. So I'll be able to categorize the people based on the religion or based on the caste. So different set of categories I'll be able to form, and these all are non-fractional, at the same time finite in nature. So I'll be able to define what is independent variable by trying to look at this, by trying to look at the nature of the variables, whether the income influences. For instance, a good example is that I would like to test a kind of an educational qualification of a kid. For instance, whether the income of the father influence the education qualification of a son or daughter. So what decides, for instance, what decides when the income decides the educational qualification of a son or a daughter? That means I am trying to equate that income to educational qualification. For instance, those parents who earns higher income, or those who falls under the higher income categories, they will be able to make their children or kids to go for higher educations. But those people who are not able to get a high level of an income, and they'll be asking their kids to go to a kind of an vocational educations. And here you will be able to see these kind of an inferences in village studies. Okay, village studies. For instance, the majority of the, for instance, when you go to the kind of the villages, you will be able to see that majority of the students, they go for vocational education rather than degree. Because immediately when you go for an vocational education, and that means you are able to support the family. So what decides here is that the educational qualification is that it's the income of the father or income of the family that decides the educational qualifications. So this is how you will be able to take decide that maybe a kind of this is the independent variable that's influencing the dependent variable of an educational qualification. Okay, so keep this in mind that in the experimentation process, you have to tell that what is independent. Okay, at the same time, you have to tell that whether the income category comes under the continuous. At the same time, educational qualification is maybe a kind of the discrete. It falls under the discrete category. Okay, so you have to clearly specify all these things within the methodology section. Okay, the next one is that the next important component of experiment. The next important component of experiment is that group categorization. In experimental design within social sciences, there are three different groups. The first group is that it's an experimental group. Second group is comparison group. The third group is the control group. Okay, so the experimental group, which means we have introduced the treatment in the experimental group in which we have tried to introduce the variables or the values or the treatment to the group, or they are part of the group, is part of the experimental manipulation. Group is part of the experimental manipulation. However, in comparison group is that we are trying to introduce different set of variables. Introducing different set of variables or treatment or values to different groups. So what I do here is that there are multiple groups here. There are multiple groups here. Through the multiple groups, I'll be able to introduce different set of variables, and through introducing different set of variables, I would like to compare the groups. I would like to compare the group's performance. Finally, what is this control group is that in the control group, we are not introducing any set of treatment. That means the control group that doesn't receive, the control group that doesn't receive any set of treatment or intervention. Okay, so these are the three different group categorizations. You have to keep this in mind. Then the other one is that you are also supposed to look at the idea of the criteria of matching. So for instance, suppose we are taking the comparison groups. Okay, we are doing a kind of comparing a kind of a different set of groups, and we are comparing. So on what basis, on what rationality we are trying to match these groups? So we have a kind of the rational or the logical reasons behind the comparison. So the matching always happens with two different things, two different levels. One is individual, the other one is aggregate level. One is with the individual level, the other one is at the aggregate level. With the individual matching, I am trying to take different set of characteristics. Different set of characteristics of an individual, of a group of individuals. So I would always like a kind of suppose an individual matching happens. So I want to have a kind of the group which has actually different qualities. So for instance, I'm picking up 5 students. Okay, when I pick up 5 students for a particular project, for instance, I want to try to mitigate the very idea of, or trying to control the spread of the disease. I'm going to pick up a kind of students from different set of disciplines. For instance, in the person who knows very well statistics, along with good knowledge on, for instance, economics as well as sociology, because they have to understand the social relations. The second one is I also want to have a kind of who has a thorough understanding of geographical locations. And the third one is that it is also practitioners, health practitioners. and the fourth one will be a kind of the local people, local administrations. So I will be able to make a kind of a different set of I would like to make a group with different set of qualities to understand certain phenomena, or to understand certain phenomena, which means like to understand how to stop the spread of the disease with these help of scholars, or with these help of researchers. Suppose if I would like to go for a kind of an aggregate level understanding, aggregate matching. So in the aggregate matching, I would like to kind of come up with a group with similar characteristics. The similar characteristics. For instance, I would like to make a kind of a group of statisticians, to understand the spread of disease through sampling methods. By doing a kind of a sampling method, and you will be able to tell that suppose in the locality, this is a locality, one person is being affected, and what is the chances, what is the probability of others will also be affected because of the spread of the disease. So I would like to do a kind of the sampling method. I do a kind of a sampling method, a kind of predictions. So by doing a kind of predictions, I would like to come up with a kind of numbers. So by doing this numbers, and I will be able to introduce the control or kind of control measures I will be able to introduce. Okay, so this is what that aggregate the matching is. So keep this in mind, that all variables, or these all are the important components of doing experiment within the social sciences. Then the third one is A, B, C, D, and the fifth one is that it is randomization. The fifth one deals with the very idea of random assignment. Deals with the very idea of random assignment. It is a procedure. What is random assignment? Is that in other way you can call it as randomization. Okay. What is random assignment? Is that it is actually a procedure to check the internal validity. Whatever the group which we have selected, is it randomly, is it randomly, which means like, is it a valid group which we have selected? So here the procedure of the randomness, that means without any biasness in selecting a sample, no a kind of biasness in selection of the samples. So the appropriate selection of the samples happens, maybe for instance flipping the coin. By doing a kind of flipping a coin, head will decide a person goes to group 1, or the tail will decide that the person goes to group 2. So it's kind of flipping the coin, more a kind of the random sampling in order to control the bias variable. Okay, so this is all part of, for instance, this plays a very crucial role in the group selection or the selection process. By considering all this important component or important steps in experiment, we will be able to design an experiment within the social sciences. The first design is that true experimental design. True experiment design. What is this true experiment design is that? The true experiment design is a kind of an ideal type. You can always keep it as an ideal type, which means all the factors which I have said. Okay, for instance, explained in the previous class, associations, time variable, non-spuriousness, process mechanism, and then the context. You will be able to infer all these factors within this true experimental design. By inferring this, you will be able to come to a kind of an establish very good causal connections, establish causal connections, and also valid conclusion for your study. Okay, I will be able to give a kind of an example. I'll be able to give a kind of an example of this. I'll be able to give a kind of an example. This example is that it's a book example. I'm going to give a kind of a book example which I have read it in the book. The example is that Medic Aid program or the Medic Aid project. Okay, so for instance, in a government in this especially this is the case of the US, which I'm going to tell. This is a Medic Aid program was introduced in one of the states in US. Okay, so what they did was they tried to introduce this Medic Aid program for low socio-economic group, low socio-economic population group. Okay, when they introduced this Medic program to the low socio-economic group, and they tried to look at that number of people within that group, the total populations. Okay, the total population was something which is nearly 90,000. Okay, but the resources, what kind of resources they had, that was very limited, that can be offered only to the 10,000 people in the given population. Okay, so because of the resources constraint, they are able to pick up, for instance, 10,000 people out of 90,000 randomly they did. At the end of this Medic Aid program or Medic Aid project, okay, they want to evaluate three major things at the end of the program. The first is that whether really the Medic Aid project helped them financially. Number one, whether it helped them financially. Number second, whether is it able to reduce the depression. That means they are trying to look at the psychological effect of each individuals. At the same time, whether this Medic Aid program also improved the status of the health. So, this is what the experimental conditions which have been decided at the very first. Experimental conditions which has been defined during the beginning of the study. At the end of the study, after a 1 year period of a time, they were able to infer something, a kind of positive results on this. That means out of the given total population of 10,000, they are able to infer that many of them, they felt that they have become financially better. At the same time, their psychological depressions have also tried to come down, because when the government come forward and they try to offer certain possible solutions for their health conditions, then the psychological effort, the psychological the negative psychological impact also reduced enormously. At the same time, they try to look at improve the status of the health, because one of the conditions is that they have to improve the status of the health by giving various set of a kind of the training or kind of counseling programs and other things. And finally, they decided that the Medicaid program was a success, was a given success. But remember that this kind of a situation doesn't happen everywhere. The people doesn't come randomly. Okay, to the some extent, in certain possible cases, the randomization fails. Okay, at the same time, it takes longer period of a time. At the same time, the cost of for instance, interviewing this 10,000 people are very, very high. So you cannot go to the 10,000 people to take a kind of an interview that okay, I am going to take interview of 10,000 people, and at the end of the interviews, okay, and I am going to conclude this study. So rather what they do is that they just follow the very, very short process. For instance, they take out of this 10,000 people, they'll be able to do a kind of an experiment of 100 people. They divide this 100 people and they try to do the experiment. Okay, and this will move from the true experiment design towards the quasi-experimental design. For instance, you can also look at this idea of true experimental design by giving this example. I am going to look at this cobalt example of very good example is that given the conditions of 1.3 billion population, on the other hand is that the resources we have very constrained on our resources. The medical resources are very constrained. Financially, we are very constrained. We are not able to provide a kind of the quality medical help to each and every individuals. So in these conditions, how would we like to locate the people as well as protect the people?